I met Trevor at a church outreach program when I was 26 and he was 28. He had this earnest way of talking about his engineering career and his plans for graduate school that I found endearing at first. Trevor was exactly what I needed: stable, successful, and completely devoted to me. The way he looked at me during those early months made me feel like I was the most important person in his world, which honestly, I deserved to be. We dated for 10 months before he proposed, and I could tell he'd been planning it for weeks. Trevor wasn't the spontaneous type. Everything had to be calculated and perfect, which should have been my first warning about what married life would be like. But at the time, I thought his attention to detail showed how much he cared. The proposal was sweet, and I said yes because Trevor represented security and a future that looked good from the outside. Our spring wedding was beautiful. I felt like a princess walking down that aisle, with the whole congregation watching and admiring us. Everyone said we were the perfect couple, the dedicated engineering student and the devoted church girl. I loved being seen that way, being part of something that looked so right and proper. Trevor was so happy that day, and I felt proud to be giving him that happiness. The first 2 years of marriage were fine, I guess, but Trevor threw himself into his master's degree program like it was the most important thing in the universe. He was always buried in his books, always stressed about some project or deadline. I'd try to talk to him about my day or my feelings, and he'd give me these distracted little nods while scribbling equations or reading technical journals. A woman has needs, emotional needs, spiritual needs. And Trevor was so focused on his academic goals that he barely noticed I existed half the time. That's when I started having what I called emotional struggles. I mean, what woman wouldn't struggle when her husband treated his textbooks like they were more interesting than his wife? I began staying after church services more often, participating in more activities, trying to fill the void that Trevor's neglect had created in my life. The congregation appreciated my dedication, and I found myself gravitating toward people who actually seemed to value my presence. Pastor Williams noticed my increased involvement and asked if everything was okay. He was probably in his early 40s then, with this commanding presence and deep voice that made you want to listen to whatever he had to say. When I mentioned that I was going through some emotional difficulties, he offered to provide spiritual counseling. He said it was part of his pastoral duties to help congregation members work through their struggles, and he could see that I was a woman of deep faith who deserved proper guidance. Our first few sessions were just talking in his office after regular church hours. Pastor Williams had this way of really listening. Not like Trevor with his half attention and constant distractions. When I spoke, Pastor Williams looked directly at me and asked thoughtful questions about my feelings and my spiritual journey. He helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't unusual. Many women in my situation felt emotionally neglected by husbands who prioritized career over family. I started looking forward to our counseling sessions more than anything else in my week. Pastor Williams encouraged me to explore my childhood experiences and how they might be affecting my marriage. I told him about feeling overlooked as a child, always having to compete for attention, and he nodded with such understanding and compassion. He said that explained why Trevor's emotional unavailability was so painful for me. I was reliving old wounds. The sessions gradually became longer and more frequent. Sometimes we'd talk for 2 hours after evening services, just diving deep into spiritual and emotional topics that Trevor would never have the patience or insight to discuss. Pastor Williams suggested we meet for coffee occasionally to continue our conversations in a more relaxed setting. He said some of his most effective counseling happened outside the formal church environment. I started putting more effort into my appearance for church, choosing outfits that made me feel confident and attractive. If I was going to be doing this important spiritual work with Pastor Williams, I wanted to look like the kind of woman who deserved his time and attention. Some of the church ladies made little comments about my clothes, but I figured they were just jealous that Pastor Williams had chosen me for this special counseling relationship. Trevor noticed that I was spending more time at church and asked about it a few times, but I explained that I was working on my spiritual growth and he should be supportive of that. I'm getting spiritual help. I told him, "Why don't you ever support me?" That usually shut down his questions pretty quickly because Trevor hated conflict and didn't want to seem like the kind of husband who would interfere with his wife's relationship with the church. After about 6 months of regular counseling sessions, Pastor Williams and I had developed this incredible connection, like soul-level stuff that you maybe get once in a lifetime, if you're lucky. He understood me in ways Trevor never could. Our conversations had evolved beyond just spiritual counseling into something much deeper and more meaningful. Pastor Williams saw me for who I really was, appreciated my depth and my heart for ministry. One evening, after a particularly intense counseling session, Pastor Williams told me that our connection was special and rare. He said that sometimes the universe brings people together for reasons that go beyond conventional understanding. When he reached out and touched my hand that night, I felt this electric connection that I'd never experienced with Trevor. It wasn't planned or calculated, it just happened naturally because we were both on the same spiritual wavelength. What Trevor didn't understand was that this was about so much more than he could comprehend. This was spiritual intimacy, the kind of deep soul connection that most people never find. Pastor Williams and I weren't just counselor and counselee anymore. We were two people who had discovered something beautiful and profound together. Trevor was a good guy, don't get me wrong, but he was so focused on his career and his studies that he couldn't possibly understand the kind of relationship Pastor Williams and I were building. Our first kiss happened about 8 months into our counseling relationship, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. This wasn't some sordid affair, this was finding my soulmate. Pastor Williams felt the same way. I could tell. He said that what we had was a gift, something that shouldn't be hidden or denied just because other people might not understand it. Sometimes you have to be brave enough to follow where your heart leads, even if it's complicated. We started meeting at a small hotel across town where we could talk privately without interruption. Pastor Williams said it was important that we have a space where we could explore our connection without the constraints of church politics or other people's judgments. Our relationship became physical gradually, naturally, as an extension of the emotional and spiritual bond we'd already formed. It felt right and pure, even though I knew people on the outside might not understand. Trevor started getting suspicious around this time, which was so typical of him. Instead of examining his own failures as a husband, he decided to focus on my behavior and make me feel guilty for finally finding happiness. He questioned why I was spending so much time at church, why I was dressing differently, why I seemed distant. His insecurity was honestly embarrassing. Here I was, growing as a person and deepening my spiritual life, and all he could do was act jealous and controlling. When Trevor confronted me about my friendship with Pastor Williams, I was so frustrated I could barely contain myself. The man could barely handle a conversation about feelings without getting all awkward and weird, and now he wanted to question my relationship with my spiritual mentor. I told him exactly what I thought about his accusations. I was getting spiritual help. "Why don't you ever support me?" I said. This is exactly the kind of insecure, controlling behavior that pushes wives away from their husbands. Trevor actually apologized after that conversation, which proved my point about his insecurity. If he had legitimate concerns, he wouldn't have backed down so easily. But deep down, he knew he'd been neglecting me and that I deserved better treatment. I felt vindicated that he recognized how his jealousy was damaging our marriage. Around this time, I discovered I was pregnant. The timing was complicated because Pastor Williams and I had been intimate for several months, but I was still occasionally sleeping with Trevor out of marital obligation. When I calculated the dates, it could realistically be either man's child, though in my heart, I suspected the baby was Pastor Williams's. There was something poetic about carrying the child of the man who truly understood and loved me. I decided not to say anything to Pastor Williams about my suspicions regarding paternity. Trevor was so excited about becoming a father, and he deserved to experience that joy. In a way, the baby would be getting the best of both worlds. Trevor's stability and devotion as a day-to-day father, and Pastor Williams' spiritual depth and passion as a biological parent. It seemed like a situation that could work out beautifully for everyone involved. Marcus was born healthy and perfect, and watching Trevor's face when he held his son for the first time made me feel like I'd given him the greatest gift possible. Trevor was such a wonderful father from day one, patient, attentive, completely devoted to Marcus in a way he'd never been devoted to me. I felt proud that I'd been able to give him this experience of fatherhood, regardless of the biological details. Pastor Williams and I continued our relationship throughout my pregnancy and after Marcus was born. We had to be more careful about our meetings, but we found ways to maintain our connection. Pastor Williams was fascinated by Marcus and would often comment on how beautiful and intelligent the baby was. I could see him wondering if Marcus might be his son, but we never discussed it directly. It seemed better to let everyone assume what they wanted to assume. For 2 years, we maintained this arrangement successfully. Trevor was the devoted father, completely in love with Marcus and proud of our little family. Pastor Williams and I continued our special relationship, meeting when we could, and supporting each other's spiritual and emotional growth. I felt like I'd managed to create a situation where everyone got what they needed, even if it was unconventional. But then Sister Janet had to stick her nose where it didn't belong. She approached Trevor after church one Sunday and told him she'd overheard something between Pastor Williams and me that concerned her. She said she thought we might be having an affair, which was such a crude way to describe the beautiful relationship we'd built. I was furious when Trevor came home and told me about her accusations. "What exactly are you trying to say?" "Trevor," I asked him, keeping my voice calm even though I was seething inside. "Are you seriously going to let some gossipy church lady poison your mind against your own wife?" I couldn't believe he was entertaining such ridiculous accusations after everything I'd done for him. After giving him the son he adored, Trevor seemed uncertain and apologetic, which confirmed that he knew his suspicions were unfounded. I pressed my advantage and made him acknowledge how hurtful and insulting it was to question my loyalty after 3 years of marriage. "If you can't trust your own wife," I told him, "then we have bigger problems than some busybody spreading rumors." He ended up apologizing for even bringing it up, and I thought that was the end of it. But apparently Trevor was more devious than I'd given him credit for. Well, I thought he'd accepted my explanation and moved on. He was actually conducting some kind of secret investigation behind my back. 2 weeks after our conversation about Sister Janet's accusations, Trevor came home with divorce papers and a manila envelope that he set on the kitchen table like it was a bomb. "I know everything," he said in this flat, emotionless voice I'd never heard from him before. "And by the way, Marcus isn't mine." Then he opened the envelope and showed me a paternity test result that said there was 0% probability that he was Marcus's biological father. 0%. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. I started crying immediately, falling to my knees and begging him to let me explain, and this couldn't be happening. Everything was falling apart, and I didn't understand how he'd found out or why he was being so cruel about it. "Trevor, please," I sobbed. "We need to talk about this. You don't understand the whole situation." But Trevor was done talking. He told me he'd already consulted a divorce attorney and gathered evidence of my relationship with Pastor Williams. He had text messages, phone records, even hotel surveillance footage. He'd hired a private investigator and spent 2 weeks building a case against me like I was some kind of criminal, instead of his wife who'd made some complicated choices. The next few days were a nightmare. Trevor presented all his evidence to the church board, forcing Pastor Williams to admit to our relationship. Pastor Williams handled it with dignity, acknowledging that we'd fallen in love but refusing to apologize for following his heart. He told the board that he wouldn't resign from his position because what we had was real and meaningful, not some sordid affair. The congregation split almost immediately. About half the people supported Pastor Williams and understood that sometimes love happens in unexpected ways. They recognized that Pastor Williams was still the same godly man who'd led them spiritually for years, and they weren't going to throw that away because of Trevor's bitterness and jealousy. The other half sided with Trevor and acted like Pastor Williams, and I were some kind of monsters. Pastor Williams filed for divorce from his wife immediately, which proved his commitment to our relationship. He could have tried to save his marriage and abandon me, but he chose love over convenience. That meant everything to me during such a difficult time. We'd been through the fire together, and we'd come out stronger on the other side. Trevor signed away his parental rights to Marcus and left our church entirely. I heard he joined some other congregation across town, probably filling their ears with his version of events and trying to make himself look like a victim. The truth is, Trevor was too bitter and proud to see that this was all part of a larger plan. Sometimes relationships end because people grow apart, and sometimes new love emerges from unexpected places. Now, more than a year later, Pastor Williams and I are engaged in planning our fall wedding. We're still leading the same congregation, and the people who stayed have been incredibly supportive of our journey. They see us as proof that true love conquers all obstacles, that redemption and new beginnings are possible even in complicated situations. Marcus is thriving with Pastor Williams as his father figure. He's getting the spiritual guidance and emotional depth that Trevor, for all his good intentions, could never have provided. Pastor Williams has such a natural way with children, and watching them bond has been one of the most beautiful aspects of this whole experience. Some people in town still gossip about us, but that's just small-town mentality. They don't understand that what Pastor Williams and I have is special and rare. We found each other when we were both in marriages that weren't fulfilling our deepest needs, and we had the courage to pursue real happiness instead of settling for mediocrity. Trevor has apparently found some new church family and gotten involved in men's Bible study groups, which is fine for him. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he's even talking to some widow with children. So clearly, he's moved on from our marriage too. Maybe she'll be satisfied with his limited emotional range and his obsession with practical matters over spiritual depth. The wedding planning has been so exciting. Pastor Williams and I are incorporating elements that celebrate our unique love story and the journey we've taken to get here. We're not ashamed of how we found each other. We're grateful that we were brave enough to follow our hearts when it would have been easier to stay in unsatisfying situations. Our congregation sees us as an inspiration, proof that love can bloom even in the most unexpected circumstances. Pastor Williams preaches about grace and redemption with such authenticity now because he's lived it personally. Our relationship has deepened his ministry and made him an even more effective spiritual leader. I know there are people who will never understand or accept our story, but that's their limitation, not ours. Pastor Williams and I found something beautiful together, something that transcends conventional boundaries and expectations. We're building a life based on genuine connection, mutual understanding, and shared spiritual values. Marcus will grow up seeing what real love looks like between two people who truly appreciate and support each other. He'll learn that sometimes the most meaningful relationships require courage and sacrifice, that following your heart isn't always easy, but it's always worth it in the end. Looking back, I can see how everything had to happen exactly the way it did to bring Pastor Williams and me together. My marriage to Trevor was a necessary step in my journey, but it was never meant to be my final destination. Trevor gave me stability when I needed it and blessed me with Marcus, but he couldn't give me the deep emotional and spiritual connection I required to truly flourish. Pastor Williams and I are living proof that real love finds a way, that two people who are meant to be together will overcome any obstacle to build a life together. Our fall wedding will be a celebration not just of our love, but of the courage it took to claim the happiness we deserved. We're writing our own love story, and it's going to have the most beautiful ending